In the bitter February cold of 1935 Montana, a broken rancher was about to make the most desperate bid of his life. What started as a reluctant trip to town for supplies took a shocking turn when he came face to face with an illegal human auction. In the courthouse square, Ezra Holbrook wasn't your typical desperate man. For 45 years, he had spent his life building the family ranch from nothing, known for his unwavering integrity and deep capacity for love, until tragedy stripped away everything that mattered. When he encountered 8-year-old Samuel, Murphy standing silent and unwanted on that auction block, he had no idea he was walking into a battle that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of county government. Ezra raised his trembling hand with his last dollar that would lead to a fight for justice that transformed an entire community. What began as an impulsive act of compassion would become a testament to the power of chosen family. The people of Whitefish County would never be the same after witnessing how love could triumph over the darkest corruption, proving that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fence post split with a sound like breaking bones. Ezra Holbrook stepped back, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter Montana air as he stared at the ruined wood. 3 hours of work in temperatures that made his fingers ache through. His worn gloves, and the damned thing had cracked clean through the moment he'd tried to set it straight. Just like everything else in his life these days, appearing solid until the moment you needed it most. He dropped the hammer into the snow, where it disappeared with a muffled thud. The wind picked up across the valley, carrying with it the promise of more snow and the kind of cold that settled into your bones and never left. February in Montana had always been harsh, but this winter felt personal, as if the land itself had turned against him. The Holbrook Ranch stretched out before him, 4,000 acres that had been in his family for over a century. His grandfather had carved it from wilderness, his father had expanded it during the boom years, and now Ezra was watching it die, one broken fence post at a time. The cattle that remained, maybe 30 head out of what had once been 200, clustered near the barn, their ribs showing through their winter coats. He'd sold off the rest over the past 2 years, trying to keep the bank at bay, but it hadn't been enough. Nothing was ever enough anymore. Martha would have known what to say. She'd always found the right words when the world felt too heavy, had a way of making him see possibilities where he only saw problems. But Martha had been dead 3 years now, taken by the influenza that swept through the valley like God's own judgment, and with her had gone whatever hope Ezra had carried for better days. He trudged back toward the house, his boots crunching, through snow that came up past his ankles. The old farmhouse looked smaller than it had in his youth, weathered grey by too many seasons and too little care. Paint peeled from the shutters, and several shingles had blown off the roof during the last storm. Another thing he couldn't afford to fix, another symbol of his mounting failures. Inside, the kitchen held the lingering chill of a house heated only by necessity. Ezra had taken to closing off most of the rooms, living in just the kitchen and his bedroom to save on firewood. Thomas's room had stayed locked since the accident 18 months ago. Some wounds were too fresh to expose to the cold. He poured coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the stove since dawn, the liquid thick and bitter as tar. As he lifted the cup to his lips, his elbow knocked against a small stack of books on the kitchen table, sending them tumbling to the floor. One fell open, revealing pressed flowers between its pages, purple lupines, and Indian paintbrush, preserved with the kind of care that spoke of love and infinite patience. Martha's journal. Ezra knelt slowly, his knees protesting, and gathered the scattered flowers with trembling fingers. The lupines had faded to the color of old bruises, but he could still remember the day she'd picked them, laughing as she'd chased Thomas through the meadow behind the house. The boy had been 6 then, all energy and questions, demanding to know why his mother wanted to keep dead flowers. "They're not dead," Martha had told him, pressing the blooms carefully between the pages. "They're just sleeping, waiting for someone to remember how beautiful they were." The memory hit him like a physical blow. He could see them so clearly, Martha in her blue summer dress, Thomas with dirt on his knees and wonder in his eyes, both of them so achingly alive that it seemed impossible they could simply be gone. The journal slipped from his hands, and he found himself on his knees in the cold kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of better days. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through his reverie. Ezra wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and climbed to his feet, peering through the frost-covered window to see a familiar figure dismounting near the porch. Tommy Brennan, all 16 years of him, with shoulders too broad for his age and eyes too old for his face. The boy had been working the ranch since his own family lost their place to the bank 2 years back, accepting room and board when Ezra couldn't afford to pay wages. "Mr. Holbrook," Tommy called as he stamped the snow from his boots. "Rider coming. Up the valley road. Looks official." Ezra's stomach clenched. Official visitors never brought good news, not anymore. Through the window, he could see a black automobile making its way carefully up the rutted drive, expensive and out of place against the backdrop of failing ranch buildings. Only one man in the county drove a car like that. Harold Harrison, president of First National Bank, stepped out of the automobile wearing a wool coat that probably cost more than Ezra made in a month. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm and wore the expression of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. Behind him came his clerk, a thin, nervous fellow who kept glancing around as if expecting trouble. "Ezra!" Harrison's voice was professionally cordial as he climbed the porch steps. "Mind if we come in? Got some business to discuss." They sat at the kitchen table where Martha's journal still lay open, the pressed flowers scattered like confetti across the worn wood. Harrison placed his portfolio on the table with deliberate care, the leather making a soft sound against the rough surface. "You know why I'm here," Harrison said, opening the portfolio and withdrawing a sheaf of official-looking papers. "The final notice. 90 days past due on the mortgage, and the grace period we discussed has expired." Ezra stared at the papers without really seeing them. The numbers swam before his eyes, amounts that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the hope he had of paying them. $1,500. It might as well have been 15,000. "I need more time," he said, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "Spring's coming. If the cattle market picks up—" "Ezra." Harrison's voice wasn't unkind, but it was final. "We've had this conversation 3 times. The bank can't carry bad debt forever, not in times like these. We've got our own obligations." The banker gestured toward the papers. "Foreclosure proceedings begin Monday. You've got 30 days to vacate." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "I'm sorry, Ezra, I truly am. Martha was a fine woman, and Thomas. Well, we all mourn that boy. But sentiment doesn't pay mortgages." After they left, Ezra sat alone at the table, staring at the legal documents that would strip away everything his family had built. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance he could hear cattle lowing, a sound that had been the soundtrack of his entire life and would soon be just another memory. Tommy appeared in the doorway, his young face creased with worry. "Mr. Holbrook, you all right?" Ezra looked up at the boy, who had stayed loyal despite having every reason to leave, who worked without complaint for meals and a place to sleep because he understood what it meant to lose everything. "Go on to town, Tommy. Find yourself proper. Work. This place is finished." "Sir, Go on." Ezra's voice cracked. There's nothing left here worth saving. After Tommy left, Ezra walked out into the gathering dusk. The cemetery lay beyond the north pasture, marked by a simple iron gate that Martha had painted white every spring. Now it was rusted and sagging, another victim of his neglect. Thomas's grave was easy to find, the newest marker in a section, reserved for children, a small granite stone that read simply, Thomas Holbrook, beloved son, 1925-1933. Ezra knelt in the snow beside his son's grave, his hands shaking as he brushed away the accumulated ice and debris. The words came then, finally, after months of holding them back. I'm sorry, boy, I'm so damned sorry. The tears came hot and fast, freezing on his cheeks in the bitter air. I failed you, failed your mother, failed everyone who ever counted. On me? The wind carried his words away across the empty landscape, and Ezra wept for the son who would never grow up, for the wife who had died believing he could hold their world together, for the ranch that would soon belong to strangers. He wept until there was nothing left inside him but emptiness and the cold. When he finally returned to the house, full dark had fallen. He lit a single lamp and sat at the kitchen table, Martha's journal still open before him. The pressed flowers seemed to glow in the lamplight, fragile reminders of beauty that had once filled his life. From somewhere outside came the sound of splintering wood, followed by the nervous lowing of cattle. Ezra closed his eyes, already knowing what he'd find. The fence he'd been trying to repair had finally given way completely, and his remaining livestock were wandering free into the night. Even his last desperate efforts to hold things together had failed. He didn't go after them. There seemed no point. In 30 days, none of it would matter anyway. The Holbrook Ranch would be just another casualty of hard times, and Ezra would be just another man who had lost everything that ever mattered to him. But as he sat in the lamplight, surrounded by the ghosts of his failures, something stirred in the depths of his despair. Not hope. That was a luxury he could no longer afford. But something else. A kind of reckless desperation that whispered maybe, just maybe, there was still one card left to play. He thought of the notice Tommy had mentioned seeing in town about Judge Blackwood's special auction on Saturday. The details had seemed too awful to believe, but desperate times called for desperate measures, and Ezra Holbrook had nothing left to lose. Saturday morning found Ezra standing in the bed of his wagon outside Morrison's general store, counting and recounting the meager collection of coins in his palm. $27.38, all that remained of the Holbrook. Fortune after 3 generations of building. Not enough for the supplies he needed, barely enough for the supplies he could survive without. The town square buzzed with an unusual energy for so early in the day. More people than Ezra had seen gathered in months filled the space between the courthouse and the mercantile, their voices carrying an undercurrent of excitement that made his skin crawl. He'd heard whispers about Judge Blackwood's special auction, but had dismissed them as the kind of gossip that flourished in hard times. Now, seeing the crowd, he wondered if there might be truth to the rumors after all. Ezra Holbrook. The voice belonged to Widow Patterson, her black shawl wrapped tight against the February chill. Surprised to see you in town. Heard about your troubles with the bank. Ezra touched the brim of his hat, not trusting himself to speak civilly. The woman had a gift for finding the sorest spots and pressing them with the precision of a surgeon. "Course, we all got troubles these days," she continued, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "Some folks handle them better than others. Some folks find creative solutions." Before Ezra could ask what she meant, a bell rang from the courthouse steps. Judge Cornelius Blackwood emerged from the building, resplendent in a black coat that spoke of prosperity, while the rest of the county scraped by on hope and stubbornness. Behind him walked Mrs. Hartwell, the orphanage matron, her face carved from stone, followed by a line of children. Ezra's blood turned to ice water in his veins. The children ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 15, dressed in identical grey, wool clothing that marked them as wards of the county. They walked with the careful posture of those who had learned that drawing attention meant trouble, their eyes fixed on the ground before them. Mrs. Hartwell positioned them in a neat line, facing the crowd, her movements mechanical, as if she were arranging furniture rather than human beings. "Citizens of Whitefish County," Judge Blackwood's voice carried easily across the square, rich and resonant with the authority of his position. "We gather today to address a pressing concern that affects us all, the burden our county orphanage places on our already strained resources." Ezra felt his stomach turn. Surely the man wasn't suggesting what it sounded like he was suggesting. "These are hard times," Blackwood continued, gesturing toward the children with the casual air of a man discussing livestock. "The county can no longer afford the luxury of maintaining these unfortunates in idleness. Today, we offer our community the opportunity to provide these children with homes and meaningful work while simultaneously relieving the taxpayers of an unsustainable financial burden." The crowd murmured its approval, and Ezra realized with growing horror that this was exactly what he'd feared. An auction, a human auction, dressed up in the language of charity and fiscal responsibility. "Each child comes with a county stipend of $5 to offset initial expenses," Blackwood announced. "In return, the successful bidder agrees to provide room, board, and proper moral instruction until the child reaches majority." Ezra wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at him to climb into his wagon and drive away from this obscenity, to preserve what remained of his faith in human decency. But his legs wouldn't obey, rooted to the spot by a fascination with evil that he'd never experienced before. The first child brought forward was a girl of perhaps 12, thin as a rail, but with the kind of bright intelligence that shone even through her obvious fear. "Mary Catherine O'Brien," Blackwood announced, "excellent with needlework and cooking, quiet disposition." The bidding started at $3. Ezra watched in sick fascination as hands rose around the square, neighbors he'd known for years competing for the right to own another human being. The girl's head remained bowed, but he could see her hands trembling at her sides. She went to the Hendersons for $8.50. They ran a boarding house on the edge of town and had a reputation for working their hired help to the bone. As Mrs. Henderson led Mary Catherine away, the girl's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as she looked back at the other children. One by one they were sold. The older boys went to farmers needing field hands, the girls to families requiring domestic help. Blackwood presented each child like a carnival barker hawking wares, highlighting their useful skills while glossing over their obvious terror. The crowd treated it like entertainment, laughing at Blackwood's jokes and applauding successful bids. Ezra felt bile rise in his throat. These were his neighbors, people he'd known all his life, and they were buying and selling children like a cattle at market. The worst part was how normal they made it seem, how easily they convinced themselves this was charity rather than commerce in human flesh. "And now," Blackwood's voice took on a theatrical flourish, "we come to our final offering, Samuel Murphy, age 8. The boy who stepped forward nearly brought Ezra to his knees. He was small for his age, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and enormous brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow no child should carry. But it wasn't his obvious vulnerability that stopped Ezra's breath. It was his resemblance to Thomas. The same serious expression, the same way of holding his shoulders, even the same stubborn cowlick that refused to stay down no matter how much water was applied. "Now I'll be honest with you folks," Blackwood said, his tone shifting to that of a man preparing to acknowledge a defect in his merchandise. Young Samuel here has been with us for 2 years, and in all that time he's never spoken a word. Not one. Some might call that a disadvantage, but I prefer to think of it as and peaceful. No backtalk, no arguments, just quiet obedience. The crowd chuckled, but Ezra heard the cruelty beneath their amusement. A mute child was damaged goods, less valuable than the others. Bidding starts at $2, Blackwood announced. No hands rose. The silence stretched on, broken only by the shuffling of feet and nervous coughs. Samuel stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on something beyond the crowd, as if he'd learned to retreat somewhere inside himself, where the humiliation couldn't reach. "Come now," Blackwood cajoled. "Surely someone can find use for a quiet boy. Think of him as an investment. He'll work without complaint and never talk back." Still no bids. Ezra could see the calculation in people's faces. A mute child would be difficult to train, impossible to send on errands that required speaking, limited in his usefulness. Better to pass and hope for better luck next time. Samuel's composure began to crack. His small hands clenched into fists at his sides, and Ezra caught the tremor in his lower lip. The boy was 8 years old, standing before a crowd of adults who were deciding his worth in dollars and cents, and finding him wanting. $1 then, Blackwood said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Surely someone—" Ezra's hand shot up before his brain could intervene. The crowd turned to stare, surprise written across their faces. Ezra Holbrook, the failed rancher who couldn't even save his own spread, bidding on a broken child with money he didn't have. "Well," Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade, "we have $1 from Mr. Holbrook. Do I hear 150? The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as Ezra stood frozen, his hand still raised, committed to a course of action he didn't understand and couldn't afford. $1 going once, Blackwood called, going twice. His gavel rose. Sold to Ezra Holbrook for $1. The crowd began to disperse, moving on to whatever entertainment the rest of their Saturday might provide. But Ezra remained rooted to the spot, staring at the small boy who now belonged to him, legally, officially, completely. Samuel looked up at him then, those enormous brown eyes meeting his for the first time. There was no gratitude in that gaze, no relief, just a kind of weary acceptance that spoke of experiences no child should have endured. The boy had learned not to hope for rescue because rescue never came. Mrs. Hartwell approached, her face still wearing that stony expression. She handed Ezra a folder of papers. "His belongings are at the orphanage, what little there is of them." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Take care of him, Mr. Holbrook. He's been through enough." Ezra reached into his pocket and withdrew his last $27, hands shaking as he counted out $26 into Judge Blackwood's waiting palm. The man's smile was all predator satisfaction. "Pleasure doing business with you, Ezra. I trust you'll find the boy adequate for your needs." As Blackwood walked away, already counting his money, Ezra found himself alone with Samuel. The boy stood perfectly still, waiting for instructions, for commands, for whatever came next in a life that had taught him he had no say in his own fate. "I'm Ezra," he said quietly, crouching down to meet the boy at eye level. I don't really know what I'm doing here." Samuel regarded him with those solemn eyes but said nothing. Of course he said nothing. The boy couldn't speak, or wouldn't. Ezra wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. The wagon ride home stretched ahead of them, 30 miles of frozen road and awkward silence. Ezra had just spent his last dollar on a child he wasn't equipped to care for, creating a crisis that would demand solutions he didn't possess. But as he helped Samuel into the wagon and saw the boy carefully arrange himself in the corner as if trying to take up as little space as possible, Ezra felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was permanently buried. It wasn't hope. He wasn't fool enough to call it that, but it was something. Maybe that would have to be enough. The wagon wheels crunched through snow that had begun falling again, each turn bringing them deeper into the isolation of the Holbrook ranch. Samuel sat pressed against the far side of the wagon bed, his small hands clutched around a canvas bag that apparently contained everything he owned in the world. He hadn't moved since they'd left town, hadn't made a sound, hadn't even shifted position when the wagon hit the deeper ruts that jarred Ezra's teeth. Ezra stole glances at the boy as they traveled, trying to reconcile what he'd done with any form of rational thought. He'd bought a child, actually purchased another human being like a sack of grain or a plow horse. The fact that it was legal, that Judge Blackwood had papers and county approval, didn't make it feel any less like madness. "Cold?" he asked, then immediately felt foolish. Of course the boy was cold. February in Montana was cold for grown men in heavy coats, let alone a child, in threadbare wool. Samuel turned those serious brown eyes toward him, but didn't respond. Couldn't respond, Ezra reminded himself. The boy was mute or traumatized into silence. Either way, conversation wasn't going to be simple. Ezra shrugged out of his own coat and leaned back to drape it around Samuel's shoulders. The boy flinched at the movement, pressing himself even further into the corner, but he didn't resist when Ezra tucked the heavy fabric around him. The coat swallowed the child whole, making him look even smaller and more fragile than before. "We'll be home soon," Ezra said, as much to fill the silence as to provide comfort. "Got a warm house, well, warm enough, and food. Not much, but enough for two." The word sounded hollow even to his own ears. What did he know about feeding a child? Martha had handled all of that with Thomas, had known instinctively what growing boys needed. Ezra had been the one who taught riding and roping and the hard work of ranch life. The soft parts, the nurturing parts, those had been Martha's domain. The ranch buildings came into view as they crested the final hill, looking even more decrepit in the gray afternoon light. The barn sagged under its load of snow. Several fence rails had fallen since he'd left that morning, and smoke barely whisked from the kitchen chimney. Not exactly the welcoming homestead a child might dream of. Ezra pulled the wagon up to the house and climbed down, his joints protesting the cold. Samuel remained frozen in place, staring at the weathered buildings with an expression Ezra couldn't. Red, fear, resignation, simple assessment of his new circumstances. "Come on then," Ezra said, reaching up to help the boy down. Samuel hesitated for a moment, then allowed himself to be lifted from the wagon. He was lighter than Ezra had expected, all sharp angles and delicate bones beneath the oversized coat. Inside, the kitchen felt arctic after 3 days of minimal heating. Ezra stirred the banked coals in the stove and added kindling, grateful, when flames began to lick at the dry wood. Samuel stood just inside the door, still wearing Ezra's coat, surveying the chaos of dirty dishes and scattered papers that had accumulated during Ezra's descent into despair. "Not much to look at," Ezra admitted, suddenly seeing the place through a child's eyes. "Been letting things slide since." He stopped himself. No need to burden the boy with his failures right from the start. He led Samuel upstairs, each step on the narrow staircase feeling like a betrayal. The hallway stretched before them, lined with doors to rooms that had once hummed with family life. Martha and Ezra's bedroom at the end, the spare room they'd planned to fill with more children, and Thomas's room. Ezra's hand hesitated on the doorknob. He hadn't been inside since the funeral, couldn't bear to face the physical reminders of his son's brief life. But where else could Samuel sleep? The spare room had become a storage space for broken furniture and abandoned projects. The door opened with a soft creak, releasing air that still carried the faintest trace of the lavender water Martha had used to wash Thomas's clothes. Everything was exactly as his son had left it, clothes draped over the chair, books scattered across the small desk, a wooden horse with a broken wheel sitting on the windowsill. Samuel stepped into the room slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. He moved to the bed and sat on the edge, running his small hand across the quilt Martha had made from scraps of Thomas's outgrown clothes. A patchwork of memories stitched, together with love and hope for the future. "This was my son's room," Ezra said quietly. "Thomas. He would have been 10 this year." Samuel looked up at him with those knowing eyes, and Ezra saw understanding there. The boy recognized the weight of grief, the careful way Ezra spoke of Thomas in the past tense. Perhaps Samuel had learned to read such things during his time at the orphanage, where loss was the common language everyone spoke. "You can sleep here," Ezra continued. "I'll find you some clothes that fit better tomorrow, for now." He gestured helplessly at Thomas's belongings. "Use whatever you need." That first night was a disaster. Ezra had managed to heat some beans and cornbread, but Samuel barely touched his food, picking at it with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to take meals for granted. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scraping of spoons against bowls and the wind rattling the windows. Ezra had no idea what children did in the evenings. Thomas had usually spent time with Martha, listening to stories or practicing his letters. Ezra's own evenings had been consumed with ledgers and livestock reports, the endless paperwork of a failing ranch. "Can you read?" he asked Samuel, then felt stupid again. How could he tell if the boy could read when Samuel couldn't answer? Samuel nodded, a small but definite response that surprised Ezra. At least the child understood him, even if he couldn't respond verbally. "There are books in Thomas's room. Help yourself." Around 9 o'clock, Ezra showed Samuel how to bank the fire in the small bedroom fireplace and left him alone to settle in. He sat in the kitchen afterward, staring at the foreclosure papers and trying to figure out what he'd done. $1 had bought him a child, but children needed food, clothes, medical care, things that cost far more than the nothing he had left. The screaming started near midnight. Ezra bolted upright from his uneasy sleep, his heart hammering as the sound echoed through the house. High-pitched, desperate, filled with terror beyond anything a child should experience. He ran for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Samuel was sitting bolt upright in Thomas's bed, his small body rigid with panic, eyes wide but unseeing. The screams continued, raw and primal, as if they were being torn from his throat against his will. "Samuel!" Ezra dropped to his knees beside the bed, uncertain whether to touch the boy or not. "You're safe. You're safe now." The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by harsh, gasping breaths. Samuel's gaze focused slowly, taking in Ezra's face, the familiar room, the reality of his new situation. Tears ran silently down his cheeks, but he made no sound. Ezra sat on the edge of the bed, his own hands shaking. "Bad dream." Samuel nodded, wiping his nose on the sleeve of Thomas's nightshirt. "Want to talk about it?" Ezra asked, then realized his mistake. "Sorry, this is new for me too." "New for me." They sat in the lamplight, man and boy, both lost in their own ways. Finally, Samuel lay back down, curling into a tight ball beneath the quilt. Ezra stayed until the boy's breathing evened out, then crept back to his own room, knowing sleep wouldn't return easily. The next few days established a pattern of awkward coexistence. Ezra would wake early and tend to the few remaining animals, while Samuel stayed inside, emerging only when called for meals. The boy ate what was put in front of him without complaint, helped clear dishes when directed, and spent long hours reading Thomas's books. But it was Samuel's unsolicited actions that began to reveal his character. Ezra returned from checking the fence line one afternoon to find the kitchen transformed. Dishes had been washed and stacked neatly, the scattered papers organized into tidy piles, the floor swept clean of tracked mud and debris. Samuel sat at the table with one of Thomas's books, acting as if nothing had happened. "You didn't have to do that," Ezra said, gesturing at the orderly room. Samuel looked up from his book and shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both helpfulness and resignation. The boy was used to making himself useful, earning his keep through quiet efficiency. The breakthrough came 3 days after their arrival, when Ezra was leading the horses back from their meager pasture. Samuel appeared at the kitchen window, then slowly made his way outside, drawn by something he couldn't resist. Belle, Ezra's old mare, was limping slightly on her left front hoof. Ezra had noticed it that morning, but hadn't had time for a thorough examination. Samuel approached the fence rail where Ezra had tied her, moving with the careful attention of someone who understood animal behavior. "Easy there," Ezra warned. "She can be skittish with strangers." But Belle wasn't skittish. As Samuel approached, she lowered her head and nickered softly, a sound of greeting Ezra hadn't heard from her in months. The boy reached through the fence rails and placed his small hand on her neck, and something magical happened. Belle relaxed completely, her weight shifting off the injured hoof, her entire demeanor changing from wary to trusting. Samuel looked back at Ezra and pointed to Belle's hoof, then made a gesture that clearly indicated pain. "You see that too?" Ezra asked, moving closer. "Been favoring it all morning." Together, they examined the hoof, Samuel's presence keeping Belle calm, while Ezra worked a small stone free from the tender frog. When the horse put weight on the hoof again without wincing, Samuel smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Ezra had seen from him. "You got away with them," Ezra said quietly. "Animals know things about people. Belle there. She's particular about who she trusts." Samuel reached through the fence again, stroking Belle's neck with gentle confidence. The horse pressed into his touch, clearly enjoying the attention. For the first time since Samuel's arrival, Ezra felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. The boy was damaged, certainly, carrying wounds that might never fully heal. But there was intelligence there, and kindness, and an intuitive understanding of creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. Maybe, just maybe, they could help each other find their way back to something resembling life. The first hint of spring came not with warmth, but with the sound of melting snow dripping from the barn roof in a steady rhythm that spoke of change. Ezra stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Samuel feed scraps to the chickens with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. The boy had been with them for 3 weeks now, and while they'd settled into a routine of sorts, Ezra still felt like he was walking on eggshells around his silent charge. "Samuel!" he called, making his decision. "Time you learned the real work of this place." The boy looked up from the chickens, curiosity flickering across his features. Ezra had noticed how Samuel's eyes tracked his movements when he worked with the animals, how the boy seemed to absorb every detail of ranch life despite never having experienced it before. Their first lesson was mending fence. Always mending fence. Winter had taken its toll on the already struggling barriers that kept what remained of Ezra's livestock from wandering off to become someone else's problem. Samuel proved surprisingly adept with tools, his small hands steady as he held posts while Ezra hammered, his attention unwavering even when the work grew tedious. But it was with the animals that Samuel truly shone. When Ezra led the small herd of cattle from their winter shelter to assess their condition, Samuel moved among them like he'd been born to it. Daisy, the ornery old cow who'd kicked 3 different ranch hands over the years, allowed Samuel to examine her hooves without so much as a tail swish. Rex, the bull who'd grown increasingly aggressive since losing most of his herd, actually seemed to calm in the boy's presence. "Never seen anything like it," Ezra muttered, watching Samuel gentle a skittish yearling with nothing but patient presence. "You sure you never worked around livestock before?" Samuel shook his head, then approached another cow who'd been limping. Without being asked, he ran his hands down her leg with the confidence of an experienced stockman, locating a tender spot near her fetlock. The cow stood perfectly still for his examination, though she'd have fought Ezra tooth and nail for the same attention. "Abscess," Ezra said, confirming what Samuel had found. "Good eye. We'll need to drain that before it gets worse." The process of treating the cow became Samuel's first real test. While Ezra held her head and spoke in soothing tones, Samuel applied the warm poultices they'd prepared, his touch gentle but sure. The cow, who should have been thrashing and fighting, stood as docile as a lamb. "She trusts you," Ezra observed. "Animals, they know things about people that we sometimes miss. They can sense kindness, sense fear, sense when someone means them harm." He paused, studying the boy's focused expression. "Whatever happened to you before, it didn't make you hard. That's something to be grateful for." Samuel looked up at him then, and for a moment Ezra thought he might speak. The boy's lips parted slightly, as if words were forming, but then he simply nodded and returned his attention to the cow. The return of Tommy Brennan on a warm March morning brought the first real change to their careful routine. Ezra heard the hoofbeats before he saw the rider, and his heart sank as he recognized the bay gelding Tommy had taken when he left. The boy had found other work, of course. Who could blame him for abandoning a sinking ship? But Tommy swung down from his horse with a grin that spoke of good news rather than goodbye. "Mr. Holbrook," he called, then stopped short when he saw Samuel emerge from the barn carrying a bucket of milk. "Well, I'll be damned. Where'd he come from?" "Language, Tommy," Ezra said automatically, then felt foolish. Who was he to correct anyone's language these days? "This is Samuel. He's staying with us now." Tommy's eyes moved between man and boy, clearly calculating the implications. At 16, he had an understanding of adult complexities that came from losing his own family to hard times. Staying permanent-like? We'll see. Ezra wasn't sure how to explain what he'd done, wasn't sure he understood it himself yet. But Tommy, bless him, simply nodded and approached Samuel with the easy friendliness that had always made him popular among the other ranch. "Hands. I'm Tommy. Heard good things about your work with the animals." Samuel studied the teenager with those serious eyes, then offered a small smile, the second genuine expression of happiness Ezra had witnessed from him. "Can't talk," Ezra explained quietly, "but he understands everything just fine." Tommy's expression didn't change, accepting this information with the same casual ease he'd shown when his own world had fallen apart. "Well, that's fine. I talk enough for 3 people anyway. Come on, Samuel, let me show you the proper way to muck a stall." Watching Tommy and Samuel work together over the following days, Ezra began to see possibilities he hadn't considered. The teenager's easy acceptance and natural teaching ability seemed to unlock something in Samuel, bringing out a confidence that had been carefully hidden. Tommy treated the boy as a partner rather than a burden, including him in conversations even when Samuel couldn't respond verbally. "He's quick," Tommy told Ezra one evening, as they watched Samuel practice the complicated knots Tommy had been teaching him. "Picks things up faster than most men I've worked with, and the animals. Well, you've seen that yourself." Ezra had indeed seen it, and it still amazed him daily. Samuel could read animal behavior like other people read books, anticipating problems before they developed, soothing distress with an intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught. The crisis that truly tested Samuel's abilities came on a cold April morning when Ezra discovered Bessie, their best milk cow, in obvious distress. She was down in the pasture, her sides heaving with contractions that spoke of calving complications. This was her first birth, and something was clearly wrong. "Tommy, help me get her to the barn," Ezra called, already calculating the likelihood of losing both cow and calf. Bessie was young and valuable. If she died, it would be another devastating blow to their already fragile operation. Samuel appeared at Ezra's elbow as they worked to encourage the struggling cow to her feet. The boy's face was tight with concern as he studied Bessie's condition, his small hands moving along her distended sides with growing urgency. In the barn, Ezra made his examination and cursed under his breath. The calf was breached, positioned wrong for a normal delivery. Without veterinary help, which they couldn't afford, both animals were likely doomed. Samuel tugged at Ezra's sleeve, then pointed to himself, and then to the cow. His meaning was clear. He wanted to help. "Son, this is dangerous work," Ezra began, but Samuel was already moving to Bessie's head, placing his hands on her neck in that calming way of his. The cow's panicked breathing began to slow, her wild eyes focusing on the boy with something like trust. "I'll need you to keep her." Calm," Ezra said, making his decision. "Can you do that?" Samuel nodded, never taking his attention from Bessie. His presence seemed to create a bubble of peace around the laboring cow, allowing Ezra to work without the thrashing and panic that usually accompanied such procedures. It took nearly 2 hours of careful manipulation, with Samuel maintaining his vigil the entire time. When the calf finally slid free, alive and breathing, Ezra sat back on his heels with tears in his eyes. Without Samuel's calming influence, he never could have managed the delicate work required. "You saved them both," he told Samuel, his voice rough with emotion. "That cow trusted you enough to let me help her. That's a rare gift, son." Samuel smiled then, bright and unguarded, as he watched the newborn calf struggle to its feet on impossibly long legs. For the first time since the boy's arrival, Ezra allowed himself to think the word that had been hovering at the edges of his consciousness: family. The riding lessons began the following week, though Ezra approached them with a sick feeling in his stomach. Every time he looked at Thomas's old saddle, he could see his son's broken body lying in the pasture, could hear Martha's screams when she'd realized what had happened. The horse had spooked at a snake, they determined later. Thomas had been thrown, his neck broken in the fall. But Samuel needed to learn to ride if he was going to be truly useful on the ranch, and Ezra forced himself to push through the memories. They started with Belle, the gentlest horse they had, working in the small corral behind the barn. Samuel's first time in a saddle was awkward, all elbows and uncertainty, but he showed the same patient determination he brought to everything else. When Belle decided to test her young rider with a few playful hops, Samuel simply adjusted his grip and rode it out, his face set with concentration rather than fear. "Good," Ezra called, surprised by how naturally the words of instruction came back to him. "Keep your heels down, hands light on the reins. Let her know you're there, but don't try to control everything." As the lessons progressed, Ezra found himself remembering why he'd once loved teaching Thomas to ride. There was something deeply satisfying about passing on knowledge, about watching understanding dawn in a student's eyes. Samuel might not be able to respond verbally to instruction, but his body language spoke volumes about his growing confidence. The first time Samuel managed a full circuit of the corral at a trot, Ezra felt a surge of pride that caught him off guard. When had this boy's accomplishments started to matter so much to him? The moment that truly changed everything came during Samuel's first attempt at milking. Ezra had demonstrated the technique several times, but the reality of extracting milk from a large, potentially uncooperative animal proved more challenging than Samuel had anticipated. Daisy, true to her ornery nature, kept swishing her tail and shifting her weight just as Samuel was getting the rhythm. On his fifth attempt, a particularly well-timed tail swish caught him full in the face, covering him from forehead to chin, in a mixture of milk and barn dirt. Samuel sat back on his heels, blinking through the mess, and Ezra prepared to offer encouragement. But then something extraordinary happened. Samuel looked down at his milk-soaked clothes, looked at Daisy's smug expression, and began to laugh. Not the polite chuckle of social obligation, but real laughter, rich and genuine and absolutely infectious. Ezra found himself laughing too, harder than he had since before Martha died, the sound echoing through the barn and causing the other animals to prick their ears in curiosity. "She got you good," Ezra managed between chuckles, and Samuel nodded, wiping milk from his eyes with the back of his hand. The boy's laughter had a musical quality that seemed to fill all the empty spaces in the barn, in the ranch, in Ezra's carefully guarded heart. When the laughter finally subsided, they looked at each other with new understanding. Something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier had fallen. They weren't just guardian and ward anymore, not just two damaged souls sharing the same roof. They were becoming something more. Tommy, who had witnessed the entire scene from the barn door, grinned and shook his head. "About time you two figured out you actually like each other." That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a simple supper, Ezra found himself really looking at Samuel for the first time in weeks. The boy had filled out some since his arrival, his face less gaunt, his posture less defensive. He'd claimed space in their small world, had made himself indispensable through competence and quiet kindness. More than that, Samuel had given Ezra something to care about again. The daily routine of teaching and protecting and simply being, responsible for another human being, had pulled him back from the edge of despair without him even realizing it. For the first time in 3 years, Ezra had a reason to get up. The boy looked up when they entered, his expression shifting from concentration to wariness as he recognized the doctor. "Hello, Samuel," Dr. Winters said, her voice gentling as she approached. "Do you remember me? I treated you for that cough last winter at the orphanage." Samuel nodded slowly, his hands stilling on the leather straps. "I'd like to examine you, make sure you're staying healthy." She glanced at Ezra. "Standard medical check, won't take long." The examination took place in the kitchen, with Ezra hovering nearby despite Dr. Winters' assurance that it was routine. She checked Samuel's weight, listened to his heart and lungs, examined his throat and ears with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely cared about her patient's well-being. "You've put on weight," she observed, making notes in a small journal. "Good color in your cheeks. Someone's been feeding you well." Samuel glanced at Ezra with something that might have been gratitude, and Dr. Winters caught the exchange. "Are you happy here, Samuel?" she asked quietly. "If someone was mistreating you, you could tell me. I would help you." The boy's response was immediate and definitive. He moved closer to Ezra, his small hand finding the man's calloused fingers. The gesture spoke louder than words ever could. Dr. Winters studied them both for a long moment, then closed her journal with a decisive snap. "Mr. Holbrook, might I speak with you privately?" They stepped onto the porch, leaving Samuel to help Tommy with the harness work. Dr. Winters wasted no time with pleasantries. "That auction was illegal," she said bluntly. "I've been researching county law, corresponding with colleagues in the state capital. Judge Blackwood had no authority to auction off those children, none whatsoever." Ezra's heart began to pound. What does that mean for Samuel? It means his placement here has no legal standing. If someone challenged it, if his relatives were found, for instance, they could take him back without any legal recourse. She paused, studying Ezra's face. It also means that everyone who participated in that auction could be charged with human trafficking. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd known the auction felt wrong, had suspected its legality, but hearing it confirmed made his mouth go dry with fear. "I'm not here to take him away," Dr. Winters continued quickly, seeing his expression. "In fact, it's clear the boy is thriving under your care. But you should know that Judge Blackwood is being investigated. When the truth comes out, there will be consequences. For Samuel, too. For everyone involved. The children will need to be placed properly through legitimate channels. Some may be returned to relatives who've been searching for them." Her voice softened slightly. "I wanted to warn you. If you care about that boy, and it's obvious you do, you need to be prepared for the possibility that this arrangement might not be permanent." After Dr. Winters left, Ezra found himself unable to concentrate on ranch work. The threat of losing Samuel hung over him like a storm cloud, making every moment together feel precious and precarious. He watched the boy work with the animals, saw the growing confidence in his movements, the way he'd begun to treat the ranch as home, and felt his heart breaking all over again. The attack came that evening, triggered by something as simple as a pot falling from the stove. Ezra had been preparing supper when the cast-iron skillet slipped from his hands, hitting the floor with a tremendous crash that echoed through the kitchen. Samuel, who had been setting the table, froze at the sound, his face going white as chalk. Then the screaming started. Not the confused terror of his nightmares, but something far worse, a sound of absolute, primal horror that seemed to tear itself from the depths of his small body. Samuel collapsed to his knees, his hands clamped over his ears, his eyes wide and unseeing as he was pulled back into whatever private hell he'd escaped. "No, no, no," he gasped, the first words Ezra had ever heard him speak. But they came out, broken and desperate. "Papa! Mama! Where are you?" Ezra dropped to the floor beside him, his own heart racing as he tried to understand what was happening. "Samuel, you're safe. You're here with me. You're safe." But Samuel couldn't hear him. He was somewhere else entirely, reliving something too terrible for his young mind to process. His breathing came in short, panicked gasps, and Ezra realized the boy was having some kind of attack. "The noise," Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "The machines, they were so loud. And then the fire." Understanding hit Ezra like a sledgehammer. Samuel's parents had died in a factory explosion. The sound of the falling pan had triggered memories of that day, dragging him back to the moment his world had ended. "It's over," Ezra said softly, gathering the trembling boy into his arms, the way he'd once comforted Thomas after nightmares. "Whatever happened, it's over. You're here now. You're safe now." Samuel clung to him with desperate strength, his small body shaking with sobs that seemed too big for his fragile frame. Ezra held him close, rocking slightly the way Martha had taught him when Thomas was small, murmuring words of comfort until the storm of panic finally began to subside. "They were working," Samuel whispered against Ezra's shoulder, his voice barely audible. "Papa was showing me the big machines. I wasn't supposed to be there, but he wanted me to see where he worked. And then there was this sound, like thunder, and everything fell down." The story came out in fragments, interrupted by fresh waves of tears and trembling. Samuel's father had worked in a textile factory in Chicago, operating the massive looms that wove cloth for the wealthy. It was dangerous work, made more dangerous by owners who prioritized profits over safety. When a boiler exploded, taking half the factory with it, Samuel had watched his parents die in the fire that followed. "I hid under a table," Samuel continued, his voice growing smaller with each word. "I called for them, but they couldn't hear me. There was too much noise, too much fire. And then some men found me and took me away, and I never saw them again." Ezra felt tears on his own cheeks as he held the boy, understanding now why Samuel had been so silent, so careful, so afraid to hope for permanence. He'd learned that the people you loved could be torn away from you in an instant. that safety was an illusion that could shatter with the sound of falling metal. "I'm sorry," Ezra whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." They sat together on the kitchen floor until Samuel's breathing returned to normal, until the terrible memories receded enough for him to recognize his surroundings. When the boy finally pulled back to look at Ezra's face, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "You spoke," Ezra said gently. "Your voice came back." Samuel nodded, testing the words carefully. It hurt to talk. After, like there was broken glass in my throat, but with you." He paused, searching for the right words. "With you, it doesn't hurt so much." The revelation that Samuel could speak, had always been able to speak, changed something fundamental between them. The boy's silence hadn't been a medical condition, but a choice, a protective shell he'd built around his trauma. That he was willing to risk speech now, to trust Ezra with his voice as well as his presence, felt like a gift beyond measure. But Samuel's breakthrough also brought its own complications. As the boy began to open up about his past, Ezra found himself confronting memories he'd tried to bury. Samuel's presence in Thomas's room, wearing Thomas's clothes, learning the skills Thomas would have mastered. It all stirred up guilt and grief that Ezra had never properly processed. The flashback hit him while he was teaching Samuel to read. Brand marks of all things. They were sitting in the kitchen after supper, Samuel practicing the symbols that identified different ranches, when suddenly Ezra was back in that terrible afternoon 18 months ago. Thomas had been so excited about the new colt, had begged for weeks to be allowed to ride him. The animal was green-broke, but seemed gentle enough, and Martha had finally given her permission for a short ride in the corral. Ezra had been in town, meeting with the banker about loan extensions. If he'd been home, if he'd been watching, if he'd said no to the ride. "Mr. Ezra?" Samuel's voice cut through the memory, young and concerned. "You look sad." Ezra blinked, finding himself back in the present with Samuel's worried eyes studying his face. The boy had learned to read adult emotions with the precision of a survivor, could detect distress before the adult themselves recognized it. "Just remembering," Ezra said carefully. "Sometimes the past catches up with you when you least expect it." Samuel nodded with the understanding of someone who knew exactly what that felt like. "Is it about Thomas?" The direct question caught Ezra off guard. They'd never really talked about Thomas, beyond that first explanation of whose room Samuel was sleeping in. "He died in an accident," Ezra said slowly. "A riding accident. He was only 8, same age as you." "Like my mama and papa," Samuel said quietly. "One day they were there, and then they weren't." "Yes, like that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood the particular weight of unexpected loss. "Do you think it was your fault?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hit Ezra like a physical blow. "What? When bad things happen to people we love, do you think it was your fault?" Ezra stared at the boy, seeing his own guilt reflected in those knowing eyes. "Sometimes." Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I used to think that too," Samuel said. "That if I hadn't asked Papa to show me the machines, if I'd stayed home that day, maybe they'd still be alive. That's not. You can't think that way." "But you do," Samuel observed, with the brutal honesty of childhood. "About Thomas. I can see it in your face when you look at his things." Ezra felt something crack open in his chest, a wound he'd kept carefully bandaged for 18 months. "I should have been there, should have been watching, should have said no when he wanted to ride that colt." "But you didn't know," Samuel said simply. "Just like I didn't know about the machines. Bad things just happen sometimes, even when we love someone very much." The wisdom in those words, coming from a child who had every reason to be bitter and angry, humbled Ezra completely. Samuel had found a way to carry his grief without letting it destroy him, to love again despite the risk of loss. Maybe there was something Ezra could learn from that courage. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Ezra opened it to find Mrs. Hartwell standing on the porch, her stern face shadowed with worry in the lamplight. "Mrs. Hartwell," Ezra said, surprised. "It's late. Is everything all right?" "I needed to see the boy," she said quietly, glancing around as if checking for watches. "May I come in?" Samuel looked up from his brand book as Mrs. Hartwell entered, his expression cautious but not fearful. The woman who had seemed so cold and mechanical at the auction looked different in the warm kitchen light, smaller, more human, carrying a weight of her own. "Samuel," she said, her voice unexpectedly gentle. "You look well, happy." Samuel nodded, moving closer to Ezra in an unconscious gesture of claimed protection. "I wanted you to know," Mrs. Hartwell continued, addressing Ezra now, "that what happened at that auction, it wasn't legal, it wasn't right. Judge Blackwood convinced me it was the only way to save the children, that the county was going to close the orphanage entirely if we didn't find placements for them." "Dr. Winters mentioned something about an investigation," Ezra said carefully. Mrs. Hartwell nodded grimly. "There are people asking questions, important people. Blackwood's getting nervous, and when he gets nervous, he gets dangerous." She looked directly at Samuel. "I've been keeping records, Samuel. Everything that happened, everything that was wrong about that day. If someone comes for you, if anyone tries to take you away from here, those records will help." She reached into her bag and withdrew a thick envelope, placing it on the kitchen table. Samuel's birth certificate, his parents' death certificates, documentation of his time at the orphanage. Everything you might need to prove that this boy belongs here, with someone who cares about him. "Why are you helping us?" Ezra asked. Mrs. Hartwell's stern facade cracked slightly, revealing genuine emotion beneath. "Because I've watched too many children suffer for adult mistakes, because Samuel is thriving here in ways he never did at the orphanage, and because—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because I failed those children when I went along with Blackwood's scheme. This is the only way I can begin to make amends." After she left, Ezra and Samuel sat at the kitchen table, the envelope between them like a promise and a threat combined. The documents inside represented Samuel's legal identity, his claim to personhood in a world that had tried to reduce him to a commodity, but they also served as a reminder that their peaceful existence could be shattered at any moment. "Are you scared?" Samuel asked, his newly found voice still tentative with important questions. Ezra considered lying, then decided the boy deserved honesty. "Yes, I'm scared of losing you. I'm scared of going back to being alone." Samuel reached across the table and placed his small hand over Ezra's calloused fingers. "I'm scared too, but maybe being scared together is better than being scared alone." The next morning brought a discovery that changed everything yet again. Ezra found Samuel kneeling in what had once been Martha's garden, carefully pulling weeds from around the dormant rose bushes. The boy had somehow found the garden tools in the barn and had been working since dawn, his small hands dark with rich soil. "I found her flowers," Samuel said when Ezra approached, his voice still soft with wonder at his ability to speak again. "They were sleeping under all the weeds, but they're still alive. Look." He pointed to tiny green shoots emerging from the earth around the rose bushes, the first sign of life the garden had shown in 3 years. Martha's perennials, lupines and Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans and prairie grass, were returning, despite years of neglect. She must have loved flowers very much, Samuel continued, sitting back on his heels to survey his work. To plant so many different kinds. Ezra felt his throat tighten with emotion. She did. She said a garden was, like hope made visible. Even in the hardest times, you plant seeds believing in a future you might not live to see. Samuel nodded gravely, understanding the metaphor with the wisdom of someone who had learned to find beauty in small things. Can I help them grow? The flowers? I think Martha would like that very much, Ezra said, and meant it. There was something right about Samuel tending Martha's garden, about new hands caring for the plants she'd loved. It wasn't a replacement or a betrayal. It was continuity, the kind of love that transcends death and finds new expression in unexpected places. As they worked together in the warming earth, Ezra realized that Samuel wasn't just occupying Thomas's space or wearing Thomas's clothes. The boy was creating his own place in the life of the ranch, building connections that were uniquely his own. He'd found his voice and used it to comfort Ezra's grief. He'd discovered Martha's garden and chosen to nurture it back to life. Samuel wasn't a replacement for the family Ezra had lost. He was the beginning of a new family entirely, one built not on blood but on choice, not on obligation but on love freely given and received. But even as hope began to bloom alongside Martha's flowers, the shadow of external threats loomed larger. Dr. Winter's warning about the investigation, Mrs. Hartwell's nervous urgency, the documents that proved Samuel's legal limbo, all of it pointed toward a reckoning that was coming whether they were ready or not. For now, though, there was this, a man and a boy working side by side in a garden that spoke of faith in the future, their hands dark with soil that promised new growth. Whatever storms might come, they would face them together. And maybe Ezra thought, as he watched Samuel carefully water the emerging shoots, that would be enough. Judge Blackwood arrived like a thundercloud on a clear morning, his black automobile churning dust as it pulled up to the ranch house with deliberate authority. Ezra straightened from the fence post he'd been setting, every instinct screaming danger as he watched the judge emerge from his vehicle with the measured movements of a predator surveying its territory. "Holbrook," Blackwood called, his voice carrying across the yard with false joviality. "Fine morning for ranch work." Ezra wiped his hands on his pants, buying time to steady his nerves. Samuel was in the barn with Tommy, hopefully out of sight and earshot. Whatever Blackwood wanted, it wasn't a social call. "Judge," Ezra replied, keeping his voice neutral. "What brings you out this way?" Blackwood's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Official business, I'm afraid. County welfare check on the boy, making sure our arrangement is working out satisfactorily." The word arrangement carried a weight that made Ezra's stomach clench. This wasn't about Samuel's welfare. This was about Blackwood protecting himself. "Samuel's doing fine," Ezra said carefully. "Growing strong, learning ranch work, no complaints." "Oh, I'm sure he's proving useful," Blackwood replied, his tone suggesting that Samuel's usefulness was the only thing that mattered. "Strong back. For the work, I imagine. Boys his age can handle quite a bit of labor if properly motivated." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Blackwood was fishing, looking for evidence that Samuel was being mistreated, overworked, given cause to complain about his placement. But there was something else in his manner, a nervous energy that spoke of a man under pressure. "He's treated well," Ezra said firmly. "Fed, clothed, given time for schooling, everything a boy needs." Of course, of course." Blackwood moved, closer, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. Still, these are complicated times, Holbrook. Questions being asked by people who don't understand how things work out here. Urban sensibilities, you understand. Sometimes they get the wrong impression about our traditional arrangements. There it was, the real reason for this visit. Someone was investigating the auction, and Blackwood was worried about what they might find. "Can't imagine what questions anyone would have," Ezra replied, though his heart was racing. "Everything was done proper and legal, according to you." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "Indeed it was. But sometimes people misinterpret things, take them out of context. It's important that everyone remembers how grateful they should be for the opportunities provided, how satisfied they are with the current arrangements." The threat was barely veiled now. Blackwood wanted assurance that Ezra wouldn't cooperate with any investigation, wouldn't testify against the legality of the auction, and he was prepared to use Samuel as leverage to get that assurance. "Samuel's happy here," Ezra said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "This is his home now, nothing to be dissatisfied about." "Good, good." Blackwood's eyes swept over the ranch buildings, cataloguing their obvious poverty, their barely contained decay. Of course, if circumstances were to change, if questions arose about the boy's welfare, his living conditions, well, the county has an obligation to act in his best interests. Child welfare can be such a subjective thing. The meaning was crystal clear. Cross Blackwood, and Samuel would be removed for his own protection. The judge had the power to destroy their family with a word, and he wanted Ezra to know it. But something had changed in Ezra over the past months, something that Blackwood hadn't counted on. The broken man who had bid on Samuel out of desperate impulse was gone, replaced by someone with something precious to protect. And threats against the people he loved had a way of bringing out a steel in Ezra that he'd forgotten he possessed. "Judge," Ezra said quietly, "I think you should leave now." Blackwood's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected resistance. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me." Ezra stepped closer, close enough to see the surprise in Blackwood's pale eyes. "You came here to threaten my boy, to use him as leverage for whatever corruption you're trying to hide. But Samuel's not going anywhere, and neither am I." "Your boy?" Blackwood's laugh was harsh and ugly. "That mute little bastard isn't your boy, Holbrook. He's county property placed at my discretion, and if I decide his placement is unsuitable, then you'll have to explain to Dr. Winters and whoever else is asking questions why a thriving, healthy child was removed from a loving home." Ezra interrupted, his voice carrying an authority he'd thought was permanently buried. "Might be hard to justify, especially if people start wondering what you're really trying to hide." From the corner of his eye, Ezra caught movement in the barn. A small figure pressed against the doorframe, listening. Samuel had heard enough. To understand the danger and the fear in the boy's posture made Ezra's protective instincts flare even hotter. "You're making a mistake, Holbrook," Blackwood said, his facade of civility finally cracking. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Neither do you," Ezra replied. "Now get off my land." Blackwood's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. He'd come expecting to find the same broken man who'd bid desperately at the auction, someone who could be easily cowed and controlled. Instead, he'd run headlong into a father protecting his child, and the collision had left him shaken. "This isn't over," Blackwood snarled as he stalked back to his automobile. "That boy belongs to the county, and I won't forget your insolence." As the judge's car disappeared down the valley road, Ezra felt his legs go weak with delayed reaction. He'd just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the county, had probably ensured that Blackwood would redouble his efforts to separate him from Samuel. But he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. Samuel emerged from the barn, his face pale but determined. "He wants to take me away," the boy said quietly. No longer a question, but a statement of understood fact. "He'll try," Ezra admitted. "But trying and succeeding are different things." "I don't want to go," Samuel said, his voice gaining strength. "This is my home. You're my family." The simple declaration hit Ezra like a physical blow. Samuel had chosen them, had claimed his place in their small world with the fierce determination of someone who'd learned the value of belonging. Whatever legal battles lay ahead, they would face them as a family. Unknown to either of them, Blackwood's visit had been witnessed by more than just Samuel. Tommy had been in the upper loft of the barn, pitching hay down to the stalls below, and he'd heard every word of the confrontation through the open loft door. The teenager's face was grim as he watched the judge's departure, his mind already racing with plans. Tommy had lost his own family to the Depression's casual cruelties, had learned early that sometimes the only way to protect what mattered was to fight back. And if Judge Blackwood thought he could threaten the Holbrook family without consequences, he was about to learn otherwise. Meanwhile, in town, another piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Margaret Ashford sat across from Pastor Crawford in his small office behind the church, her elegant clothes and refined bearing marking her as a stranger to the hardships that had shaped most of the county's residents. "I've been searching for him for over a year," she explained, her hands trembling slightly as she held a worn photograph of a young boy with familiar brown eyes. "Samuel Murphy. He's my sister's child, my only living relative since Catherine and her husband died in that terrible factory fire." Pastor Crawford studied the photograph, recognition dawning in his weathered features. "Ma'am, I think I know where your nephew might be." "You do?" Margaret leaned forward eagerly. "Is he safe? Is he well? I've been to 6 different orphanages. Are you following every lead?" "He's not at an orphanage anymore," Pastor Crawford said carefully. "There was an arrangement. A local rancher took him in. But I have to tell you, ma'am, the circumstances were irregular." As Pastor Crawford explained the auction and its aftermath, Margaret's face cycled through shock, horror, and finally a cold anger that reminded the pastor uncomfortably of her nephew's serious expression. "You're telling me that my nephew, my sister's child, was sold like livestock?" Her voice was dangerously quiet. "The legality of the whole business is questionable," Pastor Crawford admitted. "Dr. Winters has been investigating, and there are rumors that Judge Blackwood exceeded his authority. But the boy seems to be doing well with the Holbrook family. Ezra's a good man, despite his troubles." Margaret's anger wasn't directed at Ezra Holbrook, whom she'd never met. It was focused entirely on the system that had allowed her nephew to be trafficked while she'd been desperately searching for him. But her love for Samuel was fierce and protective, and she'd come too far to be deterred by concerns about disrupting his current placement. "I need to see him," she said firmly. "I need to see Samuel immediately." Back at the ranch, Dr. Winters arrived just as Ezra and Samuel were finishing their evening chores. Her timing wasn't coincidental. She'd seen Blackwood's automobile heading back toward town and had recognized the urgent need to check on her patients. "Everything all right here?" she asked, though her sharp eyes had already catalogued the tension in Ezra's posture, the way Samuel stayed close to his guardian's side. "Blackwood paid us a visit," Ezra said grimly, made his position clear about Samuel's placement. Dr. Winters' expression hardened. "What kind of threats?" "The kind that suggests Samuel's welfare might be questioned if certain people don't keep their mouths shut about certain auctions." "That settles it then," Dr. Winters said decisively. "I've been gathering evidence against Blackwood for months, documenting his corruption and abuse of authority. Tomorrow, I'm filing formal complaints with the State Attorney General and the federal authorities. This has gone far enough." She looked directly at Samuel, her voice gentle but serious. "Young man, You may have to testify about what happened at that auction, about how you were treated at the orphanage before Mr. Holbrook took you in. Are you prepared for that?" Samuel glanced at Ezra, drawing strength from the man's supportive presence. "If it helps stop him from hurting other children, then yes, I'll tell them everything." The boy's courage humbled both adults. He was willing to relive his trauma, to expose himself to legal scrutiny and public attention, for the sake of children he'd never met. It was the kind of moral bravery that reminded them why the fight was worth having. As Dr. Winters prepared to leave, she placed a gentle hand on Ezra's arm. "You know this is going to get worse before it gets better. Blackwood won't go down without a fight, and he has resources and connections that we don't." "We'll manage," Ezra replied, though the weight of approaching conflict was already settling on his shoulders, like a familiar burden. "You won't be alone in this," Dr. Winters assured him. "There are good people in this county who are tired of Blackwood's corruption. When the time comes, you'll have allies you don't even know about yet." After she left, Ezra and Samuel sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The peace of the evening felt fragile, threatened by forces gathering beyond their small circle of lamplight. "Are you scared?" Samuel asked, echoing the question he'd posed a few nights earlier. "Terrified," Ezra admitted honestly, "but not of fighting for you. I'm scared of losing you." Samuel moved closer on the porch steps, his small hand finding Ezra's calloused fingers. "You won't lose me. Whatever happens, you won't lose me. I promise." It was a promise that a child shouldn't have to make, a burden that an 8-year-old shouldn't have to carry. But Samuel had learned early that sometimes the people we love need our strength as much as we need theirs. And in that moment, under the vast Montana sky, his promise felt strong enough to hold back whatever storms were coming. The reckoning was beginning, but they would face it together. A man who had rediscovered his capacity for love, a boy who had found his voice and his courage, and the unbreakable bond that had grown between them. Whatever the cost, whatever the odds, they were family now, and family was worth fighting for. Margaret Ashford arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning that dawned clear and deceptively peaceful. Ezra saw her coming from a distance, a lone figure in a hired buggy, her posture rigid with determination and barely contained emotion. Even before she reached the house, he knew who she was. There was something in the careful way she held herself, in the expensive cut of her dark traveling dress that spoke of urban refinement and the kind of grief that money couldn't heal. Samuel was in the barn, working with Tommy to repair a broken stall gate. Ezra made a quick decision and intercepted Margaret before she could reach the building, hoping to spare the boy the shock of an unannounced confrontation. "Mrs. Ashford, I presume," he said, touching the brim of his hat as she climbed down from the buggy. Her eyes, so like Samuel's, widened with surprise. "You know who I am?" "Word travels fast in a small county, and you have the look of family. About you." Ezra gestured toward the house. "Perhaps we should talk before you see Samuel. There are things you need to understand." Margaret's composure cracked slightly at the mention of her nephew's name. Is he well? Pastor Crawford told me about the auction, about what that monster Blackwood did. I can't believe—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. "He's well," Ezra assured her quickly, "healthy, growing strong. But he's been through more than any child should have to bear. The transition here wasn't easy for him." They sat in the kitchen, Margaret's refined presence making the simple room feel smaller and shabbier. Ezra poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly, acutely aware that this woman held the power to destroy everything he'd come to cherish. "I've been searching for him for over a year," Margaret said, wrapping her fingers around the coffee cup, as if seeking warmth. "Ever since I learned about Catherine's death. The authorities told me all the children from the factory fire had been placed in local orphanages, but when I went looking—" She shook her head. It was as if Samuel had simply vanished. "Blackwood made sure of that," Ezra said grimly. "The auction wasn't publicized beyond the county, no record sent to the state. From what Dr. Winters has discovered, it was completely illegal." Margaret's face hardened with anger. That man should be in prison for what he's done. Selling children like livestock. And Samuel, my poor Samuel, bought by a stranger. She stopped, seeming to realize the implications of her words. "I'm not going to pretend I was the ideal choice," Ezra said quietly. "I was broken when I bid on him. Desperate, had no business taking responsibility for a traumatized child." "Then why?" Margaret's voice carried both accusation and genuine confusion. "Why bid on him? Why take him from the only stability he'd known?" Ezra stared into his coffee, searching for words to explain the unexplainable. "He reminded me of my son. Thomas died in an accident, and when I saw Samuel standing there so small and scared..." He looked up to meet her eyes. "I couldn't let him be passed over again, couldn't let him think he was worthless." "And now?" Margaret asked, her voice carefully controlled. "What is he to you now?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Ezra could see the calculation in Margaret's eyes. She was trying to determine whether his attachment to Samuel was genuine or merely the desperate clinging of a lonely man to a convenient substitute. "He's my son," Ezra said simply. "Not by blood, not by law, but by choice, his and mine." Margaret's breath caught. "Mr. Holbrook, I appreciate that you've cared for Samuel, but you must understand, I'm his family, his only living relative. I have the means to provide for him properly, to give him opportunities you could never offer. I can send him to good schools, ensure his future." "Can you love him?" Ezra interrupted. The blunt question stopped Margaret. Mid-sentence. "Of course I love him. He's Catherine's son, my nephew." "No, that's not what I asked." Ezra leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Can you love him as he is now? Damaged, traumatized, struggling to trust? Can you love him on the nights when he wakes up screaming from nightmares? When he goes days without speaking because the world feels too dangerous? When he needs you to prove over and over that you won't disappear like everyone else he's ever loved?" Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. Tears streamed down her face as she pressed her hands to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that. But he's all I have left of Catherine. All I have left of my family." It was an honest answer, and Ezra found himself respecting her for it. Margaret Ashford might be out of her depth with a traumatized child, but she wasn't trying to deceive herself about the challenges ahead. "Maybe we should let Samuel decide," Ezra suggested gently. "Let him meet you, get to know you, see what he wants." Margaret wiped her eyes with a delicate handkerchief, struggling to regain her composure. "You'd be willing to risk that? If he chooses to come with me?" Ezra's heart clenched at the possibility, but he nodded. "Samuel's been given precious few choices in his life. If he decides he belongs with you, I won't fight it." The lie came easier than expected. In truth, losing Samuel would destroy him in ways that losing the ranch never could. But the boy deserved to make his own decision about his future, even if that decision broke Ezra's heart. They found Samuel in the barn, his small hands steady as he helped Tommy align the broken gate. He looked up as they approached, his face cycling through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been recognition as his eyes fixed on Margaret. "Samuel," Ezra said gently, "this is Margaret Ashford. She's your aunt, your mother's sister." The boy's reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of moving toward Margaret, he stepped closer to Ezra, his small hand finding the man's calloused fingers. The gesture wasn't rejection exactly, but it clearly stated his loyalties. Margaret's face crumpled at the sight of her nephew, so much like Catherine at that age, but marked by experiences that no child in their family had ever endured. "Hello, Samuel," she said softly. "You look so much like your mother. She was my little sister, and I loved her very much." Samuel studied her with those serious brown eyes, taking in her expensive clothes, her soft hands, the way she held herself apart from the rough realities of ranch life. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Are you here to take me away?" The direct question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd prepared for reunion, for gratitude, for the joy of finding her lost nephew. She hadn't prepared for the possibility that he might not want to be found. I came to find you," she said carefully. "I've been looking for you for so long. I want to take care of you, give you a proper home." "I have a home," Samuel interrupted, his grip tightening on Ezra's hand. "I have a family." But I'm your real family," Margaret protested, then immediately regretted the words as hurt flashed across Samuel's face. "Real family doesn't sell you," Samuel said quietly, and Margaret realized he thought she was talking about the auction, about Judge Blackwood's trafficking scheme. "No, Samuel, you don't understand," Margaret started, but the boy had already turned away, pressing himself against Ezra's side with the desperate clinging of someone who'd learned that safety was fragile and easily lost. Tommy, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, cleared his throat. "Maybe this isn't the best place for this conversation," he suggested diplomatically. But Samuel had heard enough. In a voice that carried more authority than any 8-year-old should possess, he looked directly at Margaret and said, "You seem like a nice lady, but Ezra is my papa now. This is where I belong." The simple declaration settled over them like a benediction and a sentence combined. Margaret stared at her nephew, this serious, damaged, remarkably brave little boy, and finally understood what she was really asking of him. She wanted him to abandon the only security he'd found since his parents' death, to trust a stranger simply because they shared blood. "Samuel," she said softly, kneeling to bring herself closer to his eye level. "I'm not here to force you to do anything. I wanted to meet you, to make sure you were safe and happy." Samuel studied her face for a long moment, then surprised everyone by stepping forward and wrapping his small arms around her neck in a brief, fierce hug. "Thank you for looking for me," he whispered against her ear. "Mama would be glad that you looked for me." Margaret closed her eyes, holding her nephew for the first and possibly last time, memorizing the feel of his small body, the sweet scent of his hair. When he pulled back, she managed a watery smile. "Your mama loved you so much," she told him, "and so do I. Even if you stay here, even if you choose this family over me, I'll always love you." It was the most gracious defeat Ezra had ever witnessed, and it made him respect Margaret Ashford more than all her money and refinement ever could have. The confrontation at the ranch was only the beginning. By evening, news of Margaret's arrival had spread through the county like wildfire, carried by the same gossip networks that had once buzzed with speculation about the auction. The revelation that one of the auction children had wealthy relatives asking questions sent shockwaves through the community that had largely chosen to ignore the moral implications of Blackwood's scheme. Pastor Crawford found his conscience. That Sunday morning, standing before his congregation with a prepared sermon about personal responsibility and moral courage. But as he looked out at the faces of his parishioners, people who had attended the auction, people who had bid on children, people who had simply looked the away, his carefully crafted words abandoned him. "I've been thinking about children this week," he said instead, his voice carrying a strength that surprised even him. "About how Jesus said we must become like little children to enter the kingdom of heaven. About how he warned that anyone who harms a child would be better off thrown into the sea with a millstone around their neck." The congregation shifted uncomfortably, sensing that their pastor was building towards something they didn't want to hear. "6 weeks ago, many of you attended what Judge Blackwood called an auction in the courthouse square," Pastor Crawford continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You watched children, orphaned, frightened children, being sold to the highest bidder. Some of you participated. All of us allowed it to happen." Murmurs of protest rippled through the church, but Pastor Crawford pressed on. "I've been telling myself it was legal, that it was for the children's own good, that Judge Blackwood knew what he was doing. But law and morality aren't the same thing, and I can't stand before God knowing I failed to speak against evil when I had the chance." The pastor's words lit a fuse that had been smoldering in the community's collective conscience. By Wednesday, 3 more families had come forward with evidence of Judge Blackwood's corruption, kickbacks from county contracts, embezzled funds meant for orphanage maintenance, falsified records that hid the true scope of his crimes. Mrs. Hartwell, emboldened by the growing movement against Blackwood, arrived at Dr. Winter's office with a leather satchel full of documentation she'd been secretly maintaining for over 2 years. Financial records, correspondence, witness statements, everything needed to build a comprehensive case against the judge's illegal activities. "I should have acted sooner," she told Dr. Winters, her stern facade finally cracking to reveal the guilt and shame beneath. "Those children trusted me to protect them, and I failed them all." "You're acting now," Dr. Winters replied, reviewing the damning evidence. "That's what matters. This documentation could bring down Blackwood's entire operation." But Blackwood wasn't planning to go down without a fight. As evidence mounted against him, he grew increasingly desperate and dangerous. When Tommy rode into town for supplies, he overheard the judge meeting with several men whose reputation suggested they weren't particular about the legality of their work. "The Holbrook place needs to understand that harboring stolen property has consequences," Blackwood was saying, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Tommy didn't wait to hear more. He rode hard back to the ranch, where he found Ezra and Samuel working in Martha's garden, carefully tending the emerging flowers that had become a symbol of their hope for the future. "Mr. Holbrook," Tommy called, swinging down from his horse. Before it had fully stopped, "We've got trouble coming. Blackwood's hiring men, talking about consequences for people who won't cooperate." Ezra's blood ran cold as he processed the implications. Blackwood was moving beyond legal intimidation into outright violence. The ranch was isolated, vulnerable, and Ezra had precious few resources to defend it. But Tommy wasn't finished. "I've been talking to some of the other boys in town, ranch hands, farm workers, men who've had their own run-ins with Blackwood's corruption. They're willing to help, Mr. Holbrook. They remember what it's like to be powerless, and they don't want to see it happen to Samuel." By Friday evening, the Holbrook Ranch had transformed into something resembling a fortress. Young men from across the county had quietly made their way to the property, bringing rifles, determination, and stories of their own encounters with Blackwood's abuse of power. They positioned themselves in the barn, the bunkhouse, even in the trees surrounding the ranch buildings, creating a protective perimeter that sent a clear message. Samuel Murphy Holbrook was under the protection of people who had nothing left to lose. Dr. Winters arrived Saturday morning with Margaret Ashford and a formal petition for emergency custody that would remove Samuel from Blackwood's jurisdiction entirely. The legal maneuver was complex, requiring cooperation between county and federal authorities, but it offered the best hope of protecting the boy while the criminal case against Blackwood proceeded. The hearing is set for Monday morning, Dr. Winters explained as they gathered in the kitchen. Samuel will need to testify about his wishes, about his treatment here versus the orphanage. Are you prepared for that? Samuel, who had been listening quietly from his seat beside Ezra, nodded with the grave determination that had become his trademark. I'll tell them the truth about everything. Margaret, who had spent the week observing her nephew's life at the ranch, reached across the table to touch his hand gently. Samuel, I want you to know that whatever you decide to tell the judge on Monday, I support your choice. If you want to stay here with Ezra, I'll do everything in my power to help make that happen legally. The gesture of sacrifice was so profound that Ezra felt tears prick his eyes. Margaret was giving up her claim to the only family she had left because she'd recognized that love sometimes meant letting go. Would you visit sometimes? Samuel asked quietly. I'd like to know more about my mama, about what she was like when she was little. Margaret's smile was radiant through her tears. I would love that. I have so many stories to tell you about Catherine, and photographs. Would you like to see photographs of your parents when they were young? As the weekend wore on, the battle lines became increasingly clear. On one side stood Judge Blackwood, backed by political connections and the kind of institutional power that had allowed his corruption to flourish unchecked. On the other side was a loose coalition of ordinary people who had finally found the courage to stand up to a system that had failed the most vulnerable members of their community. Sunday evening found Ezra and Samuel sitting on the porch steps, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The young men who had come to protect them maintained their quiet vigil from the shadows, their presence both comforting and sobering. Are you scared about tomorrow? Ezra asked, breaking the peaceful silence. Samuel considered the question with his characteristic seriousness. A little, but not scared like before. This time, I get to choose what happens to me. That makes it different. Ezra pulled the boy closer, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and protectiveness that Samuel always inspired. You've been braver than any child should have to be. Tomorrow, no matter what happens, I want you to remember that you're loved. By me, by Tommy, by Margaret, by all these young men who came here to protect you. You're not alone anymore. Samuel leaned against Ezra's shoulder, his small hand finding the man's calloused fingers in the gesture that had become their silent language of belonging. I know, and you're not alone either. We're family now, no matter what any judge says. As stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, father and son sat together on the porch of the ranch that had become their refuge, surrounded by friends who had become their army. Tomorrow would bring the legal battle that would determine their future, but tonight they were simply a family, drawing strength from each other and from the knowledge that some bonds are stronger than law, deeper than blood, and more permanent than any document could ever make them. The battle lines were drawn, the stakes had never been higher, and the outcome remained uncertain. But whatever Monday's hearing might bring, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, with courage, and with the unshakable conviction that love was worth fighting for. They came in the dead of night, when honest folk were sleeping and only predators moved through the darkness. Ezra woke to the sound of horses approaching, too many horses, moving too deliberately to be anything but trouble. He slipped from his bed and crept to the window, his heart hammering as he counted the silhouettes against the starlit sky. Judge Blackwood sat his horse like a general surveying a battlefield, flanked by 2 county deputies whose nervous postures suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with their orders. Behind them rode 4 men whose faces were hidden in shadow, but whose presence spoke of violence held barely in check. Holbrook, Blackwood's voice cut through the night air with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I have a court order for the immediate removal of the minor Samuel. Murphy, bring him out. Ezra's blood turned to ice. There had been no hearing, no legal process, no opportunity for defense. Blackwood was using the cover of darkness and the pretense of emergency powers to steal Samuel away before anyone could stop him. Moving quickly, Ezra crossed the hall to Samuel's room. The boy was already awake, sitting up in bed with those knowing eyes that had learned to read danger in adult voices. "They're here for me," Samuel whispered, and it wasn't a question. "Yes." Ezra gathered the boy in his arms, feeling the small body trembling against his chest. "But they're not taking you. Not tonight. Not ever." He carried Samuel downstairs, barricading the kitchen door with the heavy table, while his mind raced through their limited options. The young men who had come to protect them were scattered across the property, probably already moving into defensive positions. But against armed deputies with legal authority, their presence might only escalate the situation into deadly violence. "Holbrook!" Blackwood called again, closer now. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. The boy comes with us tonight, and no one gets hurt." Through the kitchen window, Ezra could see figures moving around the house, positioning themselves to prevent escape. Blackwood had planned this carefully, waiting until the formal hearing was scheduled to make his move seem legitimate. Samuel pressed close to Ezra's side, his small hand clutching the man's shirt with desperate strength. "I don't want to go with them," he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of too much fear for such a small body to carry. "You're not going anywhere," Ezra promised, though he had no idea how to keep that promise. "This is your home. I'm your family. They can't change that." A heavy fist pounded on the front door, the sound echoing through the house like gunshots. "Open up, Holbrook, by order of the county court." Ezra ignored the demand, instead moving to the kitchen window where he could see Tommy creeping along the barn wall, using the shadows to avoid detection. The teenager caught sight of Ezra's face in the window and held up one hand, signaling that he was going for help. Then he disappeared into the darkness, and Ezra prayed the boy would reach town before Blackwood lost patience. "Papa," Samuel whispered, and the word hit Ezra like a lightning bolt. It was the first time Samuel had called him that. The first time the boy had spoken the word that claimed their relationship as something unbreakable. Even in the midst of crisis, the simple syllables filled Ezra with a fierce joy that burned away his fear. "I'm here, son," Ezra whispered back, pulling Samuel closer. "I'm right here." The sound of splintering wood announced that Blackwood's patience had run out. Heavy boots stomped across the front porch, and Ezra heard the judge's voice, directing his men to search the house. They had minutes, maybe less, before the kitchen door gave way. But then, through the darkness, came the sound of approaching wagons. Many wagons, moving fast and carrying far more people than Blackwood had brought with him. Ezra's heart leaped as he recognized the voices calling out in the night. "Judge Blackwood!" Dr. Winter's voice carried the authority of righteous anger and legal backing. "Stand down immediately. You're in violation of federal law." Through the window, Ezra watched in amazement as the yard filled with people. Dr. Winters, Pastor Crawford, and Margaret Ashford arrived in the lead wagon, followed by dozens of townspeople who had driven through the night to reach the ranch. Behind them came the young men who had been guarding the property, now openly carrying rifles and forming a protective perimeter around the house. Mrs. Hartwell stepped down from one of the wagons, her stern face set with the determination of someone who had finally chosen a side. In her hands, she carried a thick folder of documents that Ezra recognized as the evidence she'd been secretly gathering against Blackwood. "Judge Blackwood," Mrs. Hartwell's voice rang out clear and strong across the yard, "I hereby accuse you of embezzlement, fraud, and illegal trafficking in human beings. These documents prove that you have been stealing county funds and selling children without legal authority for over 2 years." The crowd murmured its agreement, and Ezra realized that the entire community had rallied to Samuel's defense. Ranchers who had lost their spreads to Blackwood's corrupt dealings, families who had been victimized by his abuse of power. Young, people who remembered what it felt like to be helpless. They had all come to ensure that justice finally prevailed. Pastor Crawford stepped forward, his voice carrying the moral authority of his calling. "Judge, in the name of all that's holy, this ends now. That boy has found a loving home with a good man. What you're doing here is not law, it's kidnapping." Blackwood's face was white with rage and growing panic as he realized his carefully planned operation was falling apart. "I have legal authority," he shouted. "That boy is county property, and I will place him where I see fit." "No," Dr. Winters replied, producing a set of official documents that gleamed white in the lamplight. "You have no authority at all. These papers from the State Attorney General suspend all your powers pending investigation into your criminal activities. Samuel Murphy is now under the protection of federal marshals." As if summoned by her words, two men in federal badges emerged from the crowd, their presence lending official weight to the confrontation. Blackwood looked around wildly, seeing his authority crumbling and his escape routes cut off by an entire community that had finally found its voice. Margaret Ashford approached the house, her refined voice cutting through the chaos with calm determination. "Samuel, it's Aunt Margaret. You're safe now. No one is going to take you away from your papa." Hearing those words, "your papa," from Margaret's lips, was Samuel's final vindication. His aunt, his blood relative, his legal family, was publicly acknowledging that Ezra was his true father. The gift of that recognition freed something in Samuel's chest that had been locked tight since his parents' death. "Papa!" Samuel called out, his voice carrying clear and strong through the night air. "Papa, they can't take me, can they?" The sound of Samuel's voice, confident and unafraid, broke the last of Blackwood's power over the situation. Here was a child who'd been silenced by trauma, speaking with the courage of someone who finally felt safe enough to be heard. Here was proof that love could heal what corruption had broken. Ezra opened the kitchen door and stepped onto the porch, Samuel in his arms, surrounded by an entire community that had chosen to stand with them against injustice. "No, son," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "They can't take you. You're home." Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to salvage his authority. "This is mob rule," he shouted. "I am the law in this county." "Not anymore," one of the federal marshals replied calmly, producing a set of handcuffs. "Judge Cornelius Blackwood, you're under arrest for violation of federal trafficking laws, embezzlement of county funds, and abuse of public office." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Blackwood's wrists, a cheer went up from the crowd. Justice had finally caught up with a man who had used his power to prey on the vulnerable, and the community that had once cowered before his authority now stood together in defiant celebration. Samuel buried his face against Ezra's neck, overwhelmed by the noise and emotion, but secure in the knowledge that these people had come to protect him. "Papa," he whispered again, as if testing the word, savoring its taste. "Papa, I was so scared." "I know, son, but it's over now. We're safe. We're together. And that's all that matters." Dr. Winters approached the porch, her face glowing with triumph and relief. "The formal custody hearing is still scheduled for Monday, but with Blackwood's arrest and Margaret's support, it should be just a formality. Samuel belongs here with you, and now everyone knows it." Margaret climbed the porch steps slowly, her eyes fixed on Samuel with a mixture of love and profound sadness. "Samuel," she said softly, "I want you to know that I love you very much, and I'm so proud of the brave, wonderful boy you've become. Your papa is very lucky to have you." Samuel looked up at her with those serious brown eyes, then surprised everyone by reaching out to take her hand. "Will you come visit us? I'd like you to be part of our family too." Margaret's tears fell freely now, but they were tears of joy, rather than loss. I would love that more than anything in the world. As the crowd began to disperse, people approaching Ezra and Samuel to offer congratulations and support, the ranch felt transformed. What had been a place of isolation and struggle was now the center of a community united by shared values and collective courage. Tommy appeared at Ezra's elbow, grinning despite the exhaustion. Written across his young face, "Quite a night," he observed. "Think Blackwood will try anything else?" "Not where he's going," one of the federal marshals replied grimly. "We've been building a case against him for months. Tonight's stunt just gave us everything we needed to put him away for a very long time." Samuel lifted his head from Ezra's shoulder and looked around at all the people who had come to protect him, young and old, rich and poor, united by nothing more than the belief that children deserved safety and love. "Papa," he said, his voice clear and confident, "are these all our friends?" Ezra's throat tightened with emotion as he surveyed the faces around them, people who had risked their own safety to stand up for what was right, who had proven that a community's conscience was stronger than any individual's corruption. "Yes, son," he said, "these are all our friends. Our family just got a lot bigger tonight." As the last wagon disappeared down the valley road and quiet returned to the ranch, Ezra and Samuel stood together on the porch, looking up at the stars that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to family, from victims to victors. Samuel's voice, speaking freely for the first time in over 2 years, broke the peaceful silence. "Papa, will you tell me a story about Thomas, about Mama Martha, about our family?" And as they went inside to sit by the kitchen fire, Ezra began to speak, telling Samuel stories about the love that had filled this house before him, the love that surrounded him now, and the love that would carry them both into whatever future lay ahead. The darkest hour had passed, and dawn was finally breaking over the Holbrook ranch. The courtroom in Helena buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with its usual dreary proceedings. News of Judge Blackwood's arrest had spread throughout. The state, drawing reporters, child welfare advocates, and federal officials to witness what many were calling a landmark case in children's rights. Ezra sat in the front row, his Sunday suit pressed and his hands steady, despite the magnitude of what hung in the balance. Samuel sat beside him, small but composed in clothes that Margaret had insisted on buying, not to change him, she'd explained, but to show the court that he was valued and cared for. The boy's posture was straight, his eyes clear, and when he spoke to answer the bailiff's questions, his voice carried none of the hesitation that had marked his early days of recovered speech. Judge Harrison, no relation to the banker, and a woman known throughout the territory for her fairness, presided with the gravity befitting such an unprecedented case. She'd spent the morning reviewing the mountain of evidence against Blackwood, documents that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning years. This court recognizes that we are addressing not just the custody of one child, but the systematic failure of legal institutions to protect the vulnerable, Judge Harrison announced. We will proceed with deliberation and care, ensuring that justice serves not just the law, but the highest good. Margaret Ashford sat in the second row, her presence both supportive and bittersweet. Over the past weeks, she'd spent considerable time at the ranch, getting to know Samuel and observing his relationship with Ezra. What she'd seen had convinced her that her nephew had found something rarer than blood kinship. He'd found a father who loved him not for what he represented, but for who he was. Dr. Winters took the stand first, her medical testimony establishing Samuel's remarkable recovery from trauma under Ezra's care. In 20 years of practice, I've rarely seen such dramatic improvement in a child who suffered severe psychological wounds, she testified. Samuel has not only regained his voice and his trust in adults, but has developed the kind of resilience that comes only from feeling truly secure. Mrs. Hartwell followed, her stern demeanor cracking as she detailed Blackwood's crimes against the children in her care. "I failed them," she said simply. "I let myself believe that any placement was better than none, that Judge Blackwood's legal authority made his actions legitimate. But Samuel Murphy found the one man in that crowd who bid on him out of love, not convenience. That wasn't luck, that was providence." Pastor Crawford spoke to the community's moral awakening, how Samuel's case had forced an entire county to confront its complicity in systemic abuse. "Sometimes it takes the courage of one child to remind us all what we should have been protecting," he said, his eyes finding Samuel in the courtroom. "That boy taught us that speaking truth, even when it's difficult, is the only way to heal from our failures." But it was Samuel's own testimony that truly decided the matter. Judge Harrison had cleared the courtroom of all but essential personnel, creating a safe space for the boy to speak his truth. Samuel climbed into the witness chair with the careful dignity he brought to everything, his small hands folded in his lap as he met the judge's kind eyes. "Samuel," Judge Harrison said gently, "I want you to know that this court exists to protect children like you. Can you tell me in your own words what you want for your future?" Samuel's voice was clear and steady when he replied, "I want to stay with my papa, Ezra Holbrook. He saved me when no one else wanted me. He taught me that I was worth caring about, that I could trust adults again. He's not perfect. Sometimes he forgets to eat when he's worried, and he gets sad when he thinks about Thomas and Mama Martha. But he loves me even when I have nightmares, even when I don't talk for days, even when I'm difficult." The boy paused, gathering his thoughts with remarkable maturity. "My blood aunt, Margaret, she loves me too. But she loves the idea of me, the boy who looks like my mama. Papa loves the boy I really am, scared sometimes, angry sometimes, but trying to be brave. That's the difference." Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. "And how do you feel about your aunt's love for you?" Samuel's face softened. "I'm grateful for it. I want her to be part of our family, to visit and tell me stories about my mama and papa who died. But wanting to know where I came from isn't the same as wanting to go back there. I've found where I belong." The judge nodded slowly. "Samuel, you've shown remarkable wisdom in your testimony. This court recognizes your right to have a voice in determining your own future." Margaret's formal renunciation of her custody claim came next, delivered with a grace that brought tears to many eyes. "Your Honor," she said, rising from her seat, "I came here prepared to fight for my nephew because I believed blood ties were sacred. But I've learned that some bonds are stronger than blood. They're forged in choice, in daily care, in the decision to love someone not because you must, but because you choose to." She turned to face Samuel directly. "I formally renounce any claim to custody of Samuel Murphy. Instead, I petition this court to recognize Ezra Holbrook as Samuel's legal father and to allow me the privilege of being part of their extended family." The legal formalities that followed felt almost anticlimactic after such powerful testimony. Judge Harrison's ruling was swift and decisive. Samuel Murphy would become Samuel Holbrook, with Ezra granted full legal custody and Margaret accorded visitation rights and the status of beloved aunt. But the judge wasn't finished. This court also orders a full investigation into the placement of all children affected by the illegal auction conducted by former Judge Blackwood. Each child will be given the opportunity to speak about their current situation, and new placements will be arranged where necessary. The community's response to the ruling was immediate and overwhelming. By the time Ezra and Samuel returned to the ranch, they found their kitchen filled with neighbors bearing food, gifts, and promises of continued support. The bank president, Harold Harrison, arrived with papers restructuring Ezra's loan, influenced, he admitted quietly, by both community pressure and Margaret's generous offer to help guarantee the payments. "This ranch has been in your family for generations," Harrison said, his manner far different from his cold efficiency during the foreclosure proceedings. "It should stay that way. We'll work out terms that make sense for a working rancher, not terms designed to force a sale." Margaret's financial support came with careful strings attached: money for Samuel's education, for medical care, for the ranch improvements that would secure their future, but always structured to preserve Ezra's dignity and independence. "I'm not trying to buy my way into your family," she explained. "I'm investing in Samuel's future because I believe in the life you're building together." The other auction children's cases were resolved over the following months, each with its own complexities and heartbreaks. Some, like Samuel, had found genuine homes with caring families. Others had been placed with people who saw them primarily as free labor and required new placements. The process was painful but necessary, forcing the community to confront the full scope of what they'd allowed to happen. Dr. Winters became a frequent visitor to the ranch, initially in her professional capacity, but increasingly as someone who'd found her own healing in the Holbrook family's story. Her relationship with Ezra developed slowly, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than desperate need. She understood that Samuel would always be Ezra's first priority, and she respected the careful way both father and son approached the possibility of expanding their family again. "I'm not trying to replace Martha," she told Ezra during one of their quiet conversations on the porch. "I'm hoping to add something new to what you've already built. Samuel needs to see that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies." The legal adoption papers that made Samuel officially a Holbrook arrived on a crisp October morning, accompanied by a new birth certificate that listed Ezra as his father. Samuel held the documents with reverent care, running his finger over the official seals that proclaimed what his heart had known for months. "Now it's real," he said quietly. "Now no one can ever say I don't belong here." Ezra pulled his son close, marveling at how completely this boy had transformed his understanding of family, purpose, and hope. "You belonged here the moment you chose to trust me," he replied. "The papers just make it official." That evening they sat in Martha's garden, now Samuel's garden too, watching the last of the autumn flowers bloom before winter's return. The community that had rallied to protect them continued to support their ongoing healing, but the urgent crisis had passed. They were simply a family now, facing the ordinary challenges of building a life together. "Papa," Samuel said, using the title that had become as natural as breathing. "Dr. Winters wants to teach me to read medical books. She says I might want to be a doctor someday, to help animals like I do here." Ezra smiled at the idea of his son following in Dr. Winters' footsteps, seeing it as another sign that their small family was growing in healthy directions. "What do you think about that?" Samuel considered the question with his characteristic seriousness. "I think I'd like to help things that are hurt, but I'd always want to come home to the ranch, to you, to our family." "This will always be your home," Ezra promised. "No matter how far you go or what you become, this will always be where you belong." As stars emerged in the darkening sky, father and son sat together in the garden that symbolized their journey from despair to hope, from isolation to community, from strangers to family. The legal battles were over, the formal recognitions complete, but the real work of healing and growing would continue for years to come. Samuel had found his voice and his family. Ezra had rediscovered his capacity for love and hope. Margaret had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to choose their own path. And an entire community had confronted its failures and chosen to do better. Justice had been served, but more importantly, love had triumphed. In a world that too often failed its most vulnerable members, one small boy and one broken man had found each other and created something beautiful from the ashes of their individual tragedies. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise, built on the unshakable foundation of a family that had chosen itself. Spring returned to the Holbrook Ranch with a vengeance, painting the valley in shades of green that seemed impossible after the harsh winter they'd endured. Samuel stood in the upper pasture, watching a herd of cattle that bore little resemblance to the scraggly survivors Ezra had been nursing through hard times just a year ago. These animals were sleek and healthy, their coats gleaming in the morning sun, their movements speaking of good feed and careful tending. Mr. Patterson's interested in the whole lot. Samuel called to Ezra, who was inspecting the fence line they'd repaired together. Says he's never seen cattle in better condition, especially considering the drought up north. At 9 years old, Samuel had grown into his role as Ezra's partner with a confidence that still amazed everyone who remembered the silent, traumatized boy from the auction. His voice carried clearly across the pasture, strong and sure, with an authority that came from genuine knowledge rather than borrowed bravado. Ezra smiled at his son's easy use of business terminology. Samuel had insisted on being present for every negotiation, every sale, every decision that affected their ranch. The boy's natural gift with animals had proven invaluable, but his sharp mind for figures and his ability to read people made him a formidable partner in their growing operation. "What do you think the fair price is?" Ezra asked, though he already knew Samuel's answer. They'd discussed the market extensively over breakfast, analyzing prices and weighing their options with the thoroughness of seasoned ranchers. $32 a head, minimum, Samuel replied without hesitation. They're prime stock, and Patterson knows it. If he balks, we wait for the buyers from Denver. They'll pay what they're worth. The transformation in their circumstances still struck Ezra as miraculous. Margaret's careful financial support, combined with Samuel's extraordinary ability to heal and gentle even the most difficult animals, had turned the failing ranch into one of the most prosperous operations in the county. But more than prosperity, they'd found purpose, breeding and training horses and cattle with a care that had become their signature. They walked back toward the house together, Samuel chattering about the improvements he wanted to make to the horse barn, his hands gesturing animatedly as he described his vision. The boy, who had once been too frightened to speak, now filled the air with plans and dreams and observations that delighted Ezra daily. The ranch itself bore witness to their healing and growth. Fresh paint gleamed on the barn walls, new fencing stretched straight and true across the pastures, and the house that had once felt like a mausoleum now hummed with life and laughter. Martha's garden, tended lovingly by Samuel's careful hands, had expanded to include vegetables and herbs alongside the flowers, creating a riot of color and fragrance that drew visitors from miles around. "Helena's here," Samuel observed, pointing toward the familiar buggy approaching the house. Dr. Winters, Helena, had become such a regular presence that Samuel had stopped using her title months ago, accepting her as family with the same wholehearted commitment he brought to everything. She emerged from the buggy with the quick efficiency that marked all her movements, but her smile was pure warmth as Samuel ran to greet her. The relationship between Ezra and Helena had developed slowly, carefully, with full consideration for Samuel's needs and feelings. When Ezra had finally proposed, it was Samuel who had insisted they ask Helena together as a family. "The flowers are perfect," Helena announced, surveying the garden with obvious pleasure. "Samuel, your grandmother, Martha would be so proud of what you've created here." Samuel beamed at the praise, then surprised them both by throwing his arms around Helena's waist in an exuberant hug. "I can't wait for you to be my mama for real," he said, the words tumbling out with the enthusiasm that characterized his recovered speech. The wedding was set for the following month, a simple ceremony that would take place right here in the garden Samuel had brought back to life. Pastor Crawford would officiate, Tommy would serve as best man, and Samuel would carry the rings with the kind of solemn pride that befitted his role as the architect of their family's happiness. Margaret's monthly visits had become treasured occasions, bringing news from Chicago and stories about Samuel's parents that helped him understand his heritage while celebrating his chosen present. She arrived the day before the wedding, her arms full of gifts and her heart full of joy for the family she'd gained by letting go. "Catherine would love this garden," she told Samuel as they walked among the blooming flowers together. "She always said that growing things was like painting with living color. You have her artist's eye, you know." Samuel listened with the careful attention he gave to all of Margaret's stories, storing away every detail about the parents he barely remembered. But when she offered him his mother's jewelry box, a delicate thing of carved wood and mother of pearl, he examined it thoughtfully before shaking his head. "Save it for when I'm older," he said seriously, "when I understand better what it means to lose someone you love. Right now, I'd rather remember that I found the family I was supposed to have." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. In learning to let Samuel go, she'd gained something far more precious than possession. She'd gained the joy of watching him flourish exactly as he was meant to. The wedding ceremony was everything they'd hoped for, and more. Samuel stood beside Ezra in his new suit, the rings nestled safely in his pocket, his face glowing with happiness as he watched his papa marry the woman who had helped heal them both. When Pastor Crawford asked if anyone objected to the union, Samuel piped up with perfect comic timing, "I object to waiting any longer." The laughter that followed sealed the ceremony with joy. Tommy, now 19 and the ranch's official foreman, had grown into his role with the same steady reliability he'd shown as a boy. His easy friendship with Samuel bridged the gap between child and adult, providing Samuel with a big brother figure who understood both ranch work and the complexities of growing up in a broken world that was slowly being repaired. "You know," Tommy told Samuel during the wedding reception, "when you first came here, I thought Mr. Holbrook had lost his mind, buying a kid when he could barely feed himself. But you saved him, Samuel. You brought him back to life." Samuel considered this observation with his characteristic seriousness. "I think we saved each other," he replied. "Papa taught me that families aren't just about being born into them. Sometimes they're about choosing to love each other even when it's scary." The autumn brought new challenges and opportunities. Samuel started attending the local school, his academic abilities proving as remarkable as his gift with animals. But every afternoon found him back at the ranch, eager to share what he'd learned and to continue the work that had become his passion. It was during one of these afternoon sessions that Samuel first met Annie. She was 7 years old, thin and wary, recently placed with the Morrison family after being rescued from a situation that bore uncomfortable similarities to the illegal auction. Margaret had been instrumental in her placement, using her connections and resources to ensure the girl found a good home. Samuel approached Annie with the same patient gentleness he showed to frightened animals, recognizing in her silence and careful movements the signs of trauma he knew all too well. Without being asked, he began including her in his work, showing her how to approach the horses, how to read their moods, how to earn their trust. "She doesn't talk much," Mrs. Morrison confided to Helena during one of Annie's visits. "The doctors say she might never speak normally again." Samuel, overhearing, looked up from the horse he was grooming. "I didn't talk for 2 years, he said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes voices get lost when bad things happen, but they come back when it's safe enough." He turned to Annie, who was watching him with the same serious attention he'd once given to adult conversations he couldn't understand. "Want to help me feed the chickens?" he asked. "They're good listeners if you want to practice talking. They don't judge, and they won't tell anyone if you make mistakes." As spring turned to summer and summer to autumn, Annie's visits became more frequent. Under Samuel's patient guidance, she began to trust not just the animals, but the people who cared for them. Her first words, when they finally came, were spoken to Samuel as they worked together in the garden. "The flowers are pretty." "Yes," Samuel agreed, his voice warm with understanding and encouragement. "They're even prettier when they're shared with friends." The evening of Samuel's 10th birthday found the extended Holbrook family gathered on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ezra sat with his arm around Helena, marveling at how completely his life had been transformed by love. Samuel leaned against his father's knee, chattering about the school essay he was writing about agricultural innovations, while Annie sat nearby, still quiet but clearly belonging. Margaret had sent a package from Chicago, books about veterinary, medicine that Samuel had requested, along with a photograph of his parents that would join the collection on his bedroom wall. Tommy shared stories from his day in town, where he'd been courting Sarah Henderson with the same patient determination he brought to everything else. "Papa," Samuel said suddenly, his voice cutting through the comfortable conversation, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't bid on me that day?" Ezra considered the question seriously, as he always did with Samuel's inquiries. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not with regret. I think about it with gratitude, because somehow, out of all the terrible things that happened that day, we found each other." Samuel nodded, satisfied with the answer. "I think Mama Martha and Thomas would be happy about our family now, about how it grew." "I know they would be," Ezra agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Love doesn't end when people die, Samuel. It just finds new ways to express itself." As the stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, the Holbrook family sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but bound together by the choices they'd made and the love they'd chosen to build. The ranch spread around them, prosperous and peaceful, a testament to what could be achieved when people dared to hope and fight for what mattered most. Samuel fell asleep against his father's shoulder, secure in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. And Ezra, holding his son while his wife's hand rested gently on his arm, understood that sometimes the most broken things, when mended with love and patience, become stronger than they ever were before. The auction block was long gone, demolished along with Judge Blackwood's corrupt legacy. In its place stood something far more enduring, a family that had chosen itself, a community that had learned to protect its vulnerable members, and the knowledge that love, once planted and tended, can grow strong enough to transform the world. The story that had begun with desperation and an impulsive bid had become a testament to the power of choice, the strength of chosen family, and the truth that home isn't a place you're born into, it's a place you're brave enough to build with the people who choose to love you back. And in the garden, where Martha's flowers bloomed alongside Samuel's vegetables, where Annie was learning to trust her voice again, where love had taken root and flourished against all odds, the cycle of healing continued, promising that the best of their story would ripple outward for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.